Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. You know, I didn't see it count me in, Santiago, but I can see it recording. So we are here with Torrance Coste. Torrance, can you please introduce yourself to the audience of Blueprints?
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Torrance Coste. I'm the campaign director for a nonprofit organization called the Wilderness Committee. I'm calling in today from my home on the territories of the Cowichan people, so-called Duncan, BC, on Vancouver Island on the West Coast.
I originally reached out to you when I was trying to understand BC politics a little bit more, specifically environmentalism and progressive politicians. But that drew me to the Wilderness Committee, and I've been following their work and reading some of the publications that they've been a part of, some investigations that I found really intriguing. Tell us a little more about Wilderness Committee and what your role is as a campaign director. What's that look like?
Yeah, so the Wilderness Committee is a 42-year-old environmental organization founded here on the West Coast in 1980, kind of around a coffee table. Some grassroots advocates decided to get a little bit more organized and try to do this work in a concerted way, and put an organization together that was exclusively volunteer-based for the first almost decade, and then since has grown into a medium-sized environmental organization in the landscape here in Canada. We have close to 30 staff in 4 different offices, Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, and Southern Vancouver Island. And we work on a whole host of environmental issues. We were founded to fight for the protection of iconic old growth forests on the West Coast. And since then, our work has expanded to working on climate issues, mining justice, endangered species policy. Because of our model, we're funded by individuals, right? We take very little grant funding and zero corporate or government funding. So we rely on individuals to keep us afloat. And it's a really neat model in that, you know, individually there is a limit that to what people can do to solve these huge systemic problems. But if you have $100 a year to spare and thousands of people put that in, that can really make a big difference. And it's sort of that pooling of resources and that collective action that's sort of behind the spirit of the organization. It's what drew me to the organization almost a decade ago and what has kept me here and keeps me so excited. I joined the organization as a campaigner on the same issue that we were founded on, the protection of old growth forests. And despite it, you know, there being some successes, some wins, there is still really unsustainable logging happening in BC and across Canada, and the need for better policy, better laws, and more protection of these irreplaceable ecosystems. In 2019, I became the organization's campaign director. So I still lead our old growth campaigns here in BC, but I oversee all of our campaigns nationally. So I work with our campaigners in Ontario and Manitoba and the other campaigners here in BC to advise on our strategic direction, support them. And that part of it's really rewarding too. My interest is in holistic solutions, right? If we protect every ancient tree in the country and have the most sustainably managed forests in the world, and then run pipelines through them, you know, and build new fossil fuel infrastructure, that's not a solution. And vice versa, if we have 100% renewable energy, but really unsustainable logging or destructive mining practices, that's not an overall solution either. We need to be making this change all together. That's why the Wilderness Committee works on so many issues, and it's what I'm most excited to be a part of.
Before we get into the old growth, because I think the old growth logging. I think that'll take us to many other discussions, right? And especially it being a campaign you've worked on for so long. I'm interested at 42 years, you say the organization has been around. I don't imagine you've been there the entire time. I might be making presumptions about your age, but
I haven't been alive the whole time, not even close.
I hope you're familiar enough with the organization, though, to kind of give us an idea of how that focus or that fight has shifted over 4 decades. I see a lot of the work you're doing now emphasizes the power structures that are involved, and getting information out there, I think, has always been part of the environmentalist movement. But can you give us an idea of how that change has been like over time?
Yeah, I think the environmental movement in general hasn't done well historically when it comes to understanding and grappling with power dynamics and the way that power works. I think that the foundation of the modern environmental movement in the early 70s and into the 80s was very much coming from a genuine good faith approach, right? These are problems that we don't know enough about them, or that we just need some more understanding and some more knowledge to make better choices. And after 40 years of campaigning, organizations like ours are clear that, look, we do understand that the way that our economic system in general operates and specific industries, operate is unsustainable. We know why, we know how to make it different, but the people and institutions that benefit most from the status quo are really reluctant to that, and they have a lot of power, and they wield it well to fight against any change. And so we have shifted a lot more, both at the Wilderness Committee and I think the environmental movement in general, to calling out the bad actors, right, and naming the systems and the institutions at the root of the loss of biodiversity or the changes in the atmosphere that are impacting people worldwide. I think this is a good thing, right? Another huge shortcoming of the environmental movement is proper class solidarity and solidarity with working people, with marginalized groups, with Indigenous nations, and a more fulsome understanding of power is starting to come with better understanding of that and where we need to stand in solidarity and build bridges and broaden our movement. So, the trajectory is hopeful and positive, I think, but the pace is still not there. We need to move quicker because a lot of time has gone by. It's late in the day.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have critiqued how long the environmentalist movement stayed in the information raising awareness stage of a campaign, which needs to be done. But yeah, there comes a time to escalate. I think what you said at the beginning about how your funding is structured plays a key role in your ability to call out power. Even government grants, we know, can be really problematic in terms of what your end product can look like, and the second guessing that goes on when you have to answer to certain funding. But I guess, it is the reality that not everyone can sustain all of their work that way, but certainly a goal for most organizations, I think, to work towards. I've worked inside of so-called progressive think tanks that rely heavily on corporate funding and government funding, and I found them equally as prohibitive. Both parties were very interested in what that end result would look like, regardless of how many voices were brought to the table. It was still very filtered, and that is promising to see, like, groups being able to sustain themselves without that, because you guys are up against big money, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think, I know you're not there, but certainly a lot of the critique around COP27 or COP27 is the heavy influence of capital there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any comments there, Torrance? I saw you tweeting about it, so I know you have an opinion.
Yeah, I've been to one climate COP myself, COP 21 in Paris in 2015. We're actually sending a small delegation to COP 15, which is the biodiversity COP coming up this December in Montreal. Canada's the host for that one, and it's there's a similar convention in the UN structure, but on biodiversity and rather than climate. And just like on climate, there are strong pledges and commitments made by all the parties, all the nations around the world, or most of them, and not followed up on. My experience at the one COP that I've attended, and long conversations with friends and colleagues who have attended subsequent ones and previous ones, is that it absolutely is structured along lines of both state and corporate power. The entire pavilions, events sponsored by the fossil fuel industry, as if reforming or tweaking or changing slightly the fossil fuel industry rather than getting rid of it altogether is what's needed this late in the game. And then just, the sheer influence that stronger, richer countries have, right? You go to a session and there's negotiators, 3 negotiators on stage, one from the US, one from Saudi Arabia, and one from Mauritius or another low-lying Pacific country. And the negotiator from the small island nation says, look, I can't go home for the holidays after this because my family home is underwater now because the seas come up so much in the place where I grew up. We need to do this, this, and this, and we need to do it next year, right? And then the mic gets passed to the negotiator from the US, and it's like, okay, rather than those 2 things next year, what about these 2 things in 2045 or 2050, right? Like it's just, and then whoever's leading the session says, yep, the delegates from these countries, like the clear prioritization of powerful interests and the economic status quo and those who are already positioned at the top, sort of in that order. That's the kind of dominant feature at the COP. And that said, I do have a lot of respect for a lot of my colleagues from the activist world that attend them, because it is a place to speak truth, right? To get a little bit of attention. If none of us went, then all of this greenwashing would just sort of go unchallenged, and that's even potentially more dangerous. The fanfare around the Paris Accord, for example, was challenged at the time, acknowledged for the good that it did contain, and then really the drawbacks of it were pointed out in real time. It still got celebrated, and it still overall was framed as a good thing. But without that challenge, it's a dangerous there's a dangerous risk that greenwashing could just run amok and become the dominant narrative. And because this idea that getting on the right track or doing better is so appealing, everyone on Earth, all 8 billion of us, want to believe that inherently because it's our future and the future of our loved ones. That's a really powerful narrative, and it could easily take hold if not challenged. And then finally, it's a space to connect with other activists. One of the most powerful moments probably that I've ever witnessed in activism was as the COP21 talks were kind of coming to a head in Paris and winding down, and it was getting clear which things were going to be in the agreement and which weren't. There was a unsanctioned impromptu action. All the protests in the conference space have to be like applied for. You have to get a permit for them, which is really weird and sort of counter to the whole spirit. And there was an unsanctioned action called, and hundreds, if not a couple thousand, civil society reps went and actually blocked one of the negotiating sessions and completely surrounded it so that the negotiators in there couldn't leave the space. And eventually, the conference center police came in and cleared everyone out, and it just sort of turned into this sort of general protest outside in one of the causeways. and there was no sound system, and there was a people's mic, like a call and repeat. So, a couple dozen people stood around the speaker and yelled out what they said. And Yeb Senow, who I believe now is an activist I think he might be the leader of Greenpeace in Southeast Asia, he took the people's mic, and a couple conferences before, he was the lead negotiator for the Philippines, right? A low-lying Pacific country, very, very impacted by the impacts of climate change, and whose people have done much less to cause it than we have in rich countries like Canada. And he said he has been at the negotiating table shoulder to shoulder with the people making the decisions. And then he's been back in the villages and the little towns in his country and others around the world. And he said it's that second group that's going to make the change. It's the second group that's going to save us. And the change doesn't happen inside these conference centers. It happens at home, in our communities, in the streets. And, that was something that I haven't forgotten since, and I never will, and that I try to, remind myself of every day.
I was reading through Dr. Sindra Sharma's thread on her experience at COP27. She described it as dystopian. And one thing that really was disturbing for me is the reports that there have been attempts by northern countries like Canada to divide the global south. And then you also just finished mentioning the greenwashing that occurs here, but the preference given to really powerful voices. I don't know. I almost lean towards a disengagement of these from activists to remove any validity from it at all and create spaces where the same networking can be done, and how you amplify that to the level that these corporations can is hard, but that's particularly harmful space to know that kind of meddling is going on in the larger global movement. Because we know, you mentioned all the countries that you're talking about, these low-lying countries are part of the Southern Hemisphere. And the wealthier nations that we're seeing trying to play really negative roles in all of this tend to be from the North. And so, I imagine a disengagement might be more effective than simply participating in this, but that's hard to be measured. Folks often, I think, don't understand the level of barriers put up by the Canadian government and the impact that we have globally. I just want to draw attention to the Hill Times report that I saw. I think the headline there is, Canada's among the worst in the world for the number of big oil reps in their official delegation. So I've never gone, just to get this straight, Canada has a delegation that likely taxpayers pay for and is chosen by maybe one of the ministries, and they're including executives from big oil and gas, like the same folks that are in that amazing article, The Dirty 30. I imagine there's some crossover there.
That's right. So there's generally three groups that are at a conference like COP27, and they're delineated by you have to get a badge to get into the conference space, and the badges are different colors. At the one I went to, they were pink, green, and blue. I don't know if they're the same now, but the one color is for official government delegations, and these are the delegations that are officially from the party, right? The COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and each party is a different nation state, and they get to bring a select number of people for their delegation, right? It includes the head of state and the ministers if they're attending, subnational leaders as they're called at the UN. We call them premiers here, or provincial environment ministers, or resource ministers. Then there is the wider delegation that includes negotiators, so technical experts from both the provincial, federal level. There's often municipal governments represented on the federal delegation, and then again chosen leaders from environmental groups, Indigenous nations, and industry. And so, the Canadian delegation regularly includes reps from the fossil fuel industry, which is just absolutely outrageous in terms of the whole point, right? It includes reps from the renewable energy sector as well, which is a bit more understandable. But the influence of corporate power there is really surprising. The second two groups are civil society, right? So these are people that have applied for and gained access to the conference by the UN, but not with their country's official delegation. So again, industry is part of the civil society group as well, but mostly civil society comes from the advocacy and activist spaces, right? So the youth delegation that I went on, we had civil society badges. Most of my friends that are there now are there as civil society reps, either sponsored by or representing a larger environmental organization. And that civil society group is probably the largest at COP, and that's where you meet, people from around the world working on these kinds of things, and that's the value in going. And then the third group is the smallest, and that's media. They have a different color badge. They're allowed different sets of access, and they're there to sort of cover and report on what's happening. The question, to loop back around the question of the utility in it, and the presence of the fossil fuel industry there, both as civil society representatives, even in the space at all, let alone in official members of the national delegation of countries that are supposed to be there to fight climate change. It paints a grim picture, right? And I think there is a really strong case for not putting time and energy into the space. Like I said, I went 7 years ago, and I haven't been back. And I don't, I might never. I don't want to say I'll never go to another one, but I don't have immediate plans. I just, for my limited time capacity, there's things that make more sense to me right now. That said, the reason that there is some attention and accountability towards the presence of fossil fuel interest and the inaction is because of folks from activist spaces that are there. Right? A lot of what we know about these conferences, a lot of the international solidarity that's built out of them, there are side coalitions established, in the side rooms of these conferences. While world leaders are gathering, not doing enough, civil society delegates, again, from around the world are gathering and talking about what we actually need. So there's that potential and that power that I do think has some value, and it's why I, again, feel proud of my friends and colleagues that you choose to go and engage in that space. I think there's strong arguments for both.
No, you certainly point out a good value, because I think that brings us back to some of the work that Wilderness Committee is doing in drawing attention to exactly who's making the decisions, why some of the talking points that even come out of our governments aren't exactly on point when it comes to the damages of fossil fuels, and particularly in BC when it comes to old growth logging. I absolutely love that approach, lifting the veil, because I think so many people understand corporations as these really separate entities and entirely blame them. But the reality is that the government, plays a huge role in facilitating all of this while giving us different snippets in the media, they tell us what we want to hear front facing, and then we see something completely different. Looking through those 30 folks that listed, much of the BC NDP key players are included on that list, as well as big oil and gas. I know that won't surprise a lot of people, but I think it would surprise progressives across the country who don't have NDP governments and who work very hard to get them, that they've not actually been a huge ally as they should have been. What's your, Horgan is on his way out. A new premier is on his way in. I see you have a phone zap to welcome David Eby to his office and pressure him to keep his promise. What was his promise? I'm sorry, you're going to have to remind me. I'm trying to find it, and it's very vague. Like I'm going to immediately accelerate action. What do you expect? What do you expect from this premier based on your previous experience with the BC NDP?
We don't totally know what to expect, and that's why we're working so hard right now to frame it and to use the few things he has said to paint him into a corner and to hold him accountable to what he should be accountable to, not what he's going to say was his plan all along in a year or 2 years or 3 years. The NDP in itself has made strong promises on old growth. In the last election, they called a snap election in the first year of the pandemic in 2020. They'd been in a minority government, as the federal government is now. They'd been in a minority for 3 years, and they saw an opportunity. They'd handled the pandemic fairly well up until that point, and they saw an opportunity to call a snap election and gain a majority, which they did. They formed the strongest NDP government in terms of amount of seats, I believe ever in Canada, for sure in BC, and have ruled with a majority since. In that election, they promised to save old growth forests. Right, that's a pretty clear promise. I made sure to screenshot the Facebook ad the day it went out.
Why? You didn't think they were going to hold their word even then?
No, I didn't.
Been in it too long to know better.
Yeah, since then they haven't. Again, not a surprise, but they've laid out a plan of action that is in itself pretty solid. The NDP is really good at this. They commission studies, they receive some recommendations, and then they allow the recommendations and the plan to be conflated with what they're doing. And because the recommendations are good and the plan is good, they point to that and really create this public narrative that they're a good progressive government on it because there's so much known and there's so much media fanfare about the recommendations and the plan. In the lead up to this, there was a really controversial shuttered leadership race for the leader of the BC NDP. Premier Horgan announced that he was going to not finish out his term as premier, that he was going to retire at the end of the year. He announced that in the spring. And then there was a lot of controversy around the way which David Eby became leader of the party, which we can get into a little bit more. But
we did an entire episode on it. So
great. I'm
hoping folks can get what
listen
they need there.
Listen to that one, learn about Anjali, and yeah, okay, we're up to speed. The premier designate Eby, he's been really quiet. He's a downtown Vancouver guy. He comes from, and this is touted by NDP partisans here. He comes from an activist background. He was a civil society lawyer, a human rights lawyer, doing a lot of activism. I know friends that met him at NVDA trainings for resistance to the 2010 Olympics, right? And he was the lawyer who would show up and train activists about know your rights stuff and about civil disobedience stuff and how to get arrested. And, that's like a lot of my friends, that's the first time they ever heard of this guy. So I remember there was some excitement when he ran for the NDP. He ran and he unseated at the time premier. He ran in a fairly wealthy riding in Vancouver, and he unseated Premier Christy Clark, and was sort of lionized for that, and there was a lot of excitement.
I'm so sorry, my Bluetooth headphones died. I was on a tangent about the BC NDP, wasn't I?
Yeah, so you had introduced, a bit of a hopeful David's history but that he has been a little bit quiet since. And where I'm going to start pointing you is back to that race.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that. I think to say that he, was an activist on the downtown east side, doing a lot of legal representation and civil society work, and kind of popular because of that. It's not like he did that and then has been quiet since. He's been an opposition MLA, and then for the last 5 years, the Attorney General of BC, right? As the government has continued to fight against Indigenous rights, as the government has continued to persecute land defenders from Wet'suwet'en to Fairy Creek, he's been their top lawyer, right? He's not vocal out in the news talking about the need to build pipelines and keep logging old growth, but he is behind the scenes covering the government's butt when it comes to the legal side of things. So I think that he has a much more active role than he often gets credit for. He keeps a relatively low profile in terms of these big controversies. When it comes to the environment and climate, he's more vocal and well known on other issues like housing. But that's kind of been his background. But on old growth particularly, he's kind of played both sides. He's made statements since he announced that he was going to run for leader. Prior to that, I don't remember him ever speaking publicly on the issue. Since seeking leadership and eventually getting it, he's been asked more and more about it, and his answers have ranged, right? In some instances, he said we have to do more. In another interview, he concerningly said, we need a lot more certainty about where the old growth is. We need better inventory and better maps, which made me shudder.
More consultations?
Yeah, that's exactly what the NDP forest minister at the time said as soon as they formed government in 2017. He said, we just have to get a better understanding. We have to get more knowledge of where these at-risk forests are. In 2017, and at that time, that minister was himself doing a classic 90s remix of the last time the NDP was in government, and there are environment ministers from the NDP governments of the early 90s on record saying, we just need a little bit more certainty around old growth. We need to understand where it is. So that was extremely concerning. Then, after the party quashed the leadership hopes of Anjali Appadurai and the thousands of people that joined the party to support her, and EB was named premier designate, he knew he had to appeal a little bit to that side of the party and of course to the public that cares about these issues. And in his first speech as premier designate, he named 5 issues, and one of the 5 was accelerating the province's action on old growth. So what he meant by that, we don't know, but we're very much going to hold him to the promises that the government has made, and of course to the action that's required out on the land.
I'm just kind of snickering because that is such political language for him to use. You could quite literally read, I could be a big oil and gas exec or logging executive and hear that and be like, oh, well, that could be good for me too. What kind of action?
Yeah.
So
again, I think he's sitting on the fence right now. I think him and his inner circle aren't sure what's more politically advantageous, to come out really strong on this and pull support away from the BC Green Party and to really solidify support from their environmental wing, or is it better for them electorally, the only thing the NDP cares about, to keep this slow, plodding course that keeps logging companies a little bit happier, that eats away at the support to their right, not so much to their left. A key piece of context here that I always try and remember to mention, especially when I'm talking to audiences outside of BC, but it's especially important now because federally we have a Liberal Party, right? And for the last century, a lot of the federal governments here have been Liberal governments. when it comes to, big L liberals, red Justin Trudeau style liberals, we don't have that party in BC. We don't even have it in name as of today. There is a party called the BC Liberal Party. They were government for 16 years, from 2001 to 2017, but they were never liberals, right? They were a coalition of center-right and right-wing political interests in this province. A lot of their cabinet ministers went on to be cabinet ministers in Stephen Harper's governments. The Premier's office and Stephen Harper's Prime Minister's office would trade staff all the time. The political ideology is conservative. And as a result, the BC NDP has a ton of room to build electoral success in the middle. Obviously, the Liberal Party of Canada has been popular enough, at least for a minority government, if not a majority, since 2015. They enjoy popularity here in BC too. And the BC NDP has clearly said, look, if we fill that role, if we step up and be the Liberal Party here, because there isn't one, we can win elections, right? And that, again, seems to be their goal, as opposed to social democracy, let alone democratic socialism, like it says in their constitution. So yeah, I always try to, a lot of people know that the BC Liberal Party isn't a Liberal Party. And again, today they just voted to change their name. They're, in a couple of weeks, they'll be called BC United, which, like, are they a soccer team or what are we doing? So
I guess they will be at least feigning the Liberal. They know they've been replaced in terms of Matt Fodor likes to call them orange Liberals.
It's an important piece of context here, though, because in BC, the analog to Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland, the sort of liberalism and the centrism that is behind so many of the problems we see socially and environmentally, the analog here provincially is the BC NDP.
I mean, that's hard to hear, but again, not a huge surprise, because I'm going to go back to that leadership campaign as, full disclosure, and I don't think there'll be much of a change in how the BC NDP operates. And that's just from an outsider perspective, knowing how the NDP operates as a cookie cutter right across the country. Their insistence that EB be anointed is rooted in the need for everything to stay as it is. And I think we can't talk about old growth logging and David Eby without talking about the letter that the steelworkers, a local steelworkers union, sent out to its members that labeled activists within the party, environmentalists, eco-socialists, as extremists. Although a lot of us take issue with that part of the letter, the most important part, I think, that pertains to the conversation that we're having now was it was entirely based on the idea that the only way to keep old growth logging going would be for David to win. That as a political scientist and someone who's just kind of lived within the NDP for too long, that to me reads as there was an understanding that it wasn't explicit that any promise had been made, but to me that letter read as some sort of understanding. And knowing the connections that the previous premier has with that same particular, with the United Steelworkers, I mean, that's a huge tension, I think, that surprised someone from Ontario. I always understood the tension that exists between workers that rely on these industries at the moment and the idea of a transition away from fossil fuels. You hear it when you go to the door. I've run as a federal candidate, and that's one of the biggest things, that people know what we need, right? They know that fossil fuels are bad, but they have been told many, many times, the narrative is it's a job killer, that there's not plans to help workers through this. And, we see a similar refrain in Alberta, where so-called progressive government, for some, the only hope for climate justice. We can talk about the Green Party, I guess, but that I think would surprise people that tension exists in labor as well, like organized labor that is working with the NDP was a source of conflict in terms of doing the right thing by way of old growth logging.
Yeah, this is this sort of general topic is fraught, but it's also one of my favorite. Right? I spoke earlier about how I recognize the failure of the environmental movement to do proper working class solidarity and to fight for solutions that protect and uplift working people and don't leave them behind. And I care about changing that, right? I come from a resource family myself. My dad was a gill netter, and he had to give that up in my childhood because the fish stocks were collapsing, and he worked the rest of his career as a welder. My mom's a seamstress. My partner's a public school teacher. The Wilderness Committee is a unionized workplace. We're one of the first unionized environmental nonprofits in BC. And I care about solutions that work for everyone. I don't believe in the sort of, the Tories and Teslas is sort of the knock on a lot of the old school Green Party reps and sort of the vision, right? This, solar powered, windmill powered neoliberal capitalism, right? That's not a solution in from my perspective and from the perspective of most people that I work for. So I care about building bridges with labor unions and for finding ways to align policy and the way resource industries operate with ecological necessity. Those are bounds we can't change, but we can change the way our economy is organized and the way that people benefit and the way that we develop our societies and economic infrastructure to help the most people and to create a good, stable life for people everywhere. But the animosity between the logging industry generally and the environmental movement is as strong as it's ever been. And there's an inherent conflict between groups like the Wilderness Committee and logging companies. We're okay with that. Again, we just published a report called The Dirty 30 talking about the biggest polluters. We are okay with that enmity, and we feel that a lot of these companies need to be reined in and align their models with, again, that ecological necessity, or get out of BC. And get out of Canada, and again, that's a fight we're comfortable to have. What I don't like is fighting with the other side of industry, and that's labor and workers more generally. This isn't a new thing. The predecessor to the United Steelworkers in terms of a big vocal logging industry union was the IWA. And in the early 90s, the IWA, they put out, like lots of unions put out a calendar. And one of our legendary campaigners at the Wilderness Committee, he actually became the first paid staff at the Wilderness Committee in the late 80s, and he did a lot of advocacy around old growth in the late 80s and early 90s. His name's Joe Foy, and I think in 94 or 95, the IWA put out a calendar, and one of the months of the calendar, the photo was of old VW Bug. And it had spray painted Joe Foy's car on it, and it was riddled with bullet holes. Right, which is just like a staggering threat because things were so tense then, and he was so labeled as a killer of jobs and someone that was out to, save baby owls and throw loggers and their kids out in the streets. Right, that was the level of rhetoric, and again, that was 20 years ago. 30 years ago. And so this isn't new, but as the social safety net, as the kinds of things that the systems that really make this place a nice one to live in for lots of people have degraded, and the logging industry has fallen upon sharper and sharper, more dire and more dire straits. This tension has grown stronger. This tension has gotten to the point where the conflict is more common and the conflict is more heated. In the late 1990s, the rate of logging and the number of jobs in the forest industry decoupled. So until then, for the first 100 years of the sector, if the rate of logging went up, the number of jobs would go up. And if the rate of logging went down, the number of jobs would go down. So there was that clear, oh, if we log less, there'll be less jobs. That was a clear thing that was instilled on this province for 100 years. In the late 90s, because of globalization and mechanization, that changed. And the rate of logging has gone up and down and up and down and up and down. And the rate of jobs has just gone down. Mills have closed, shifts have curtailed, and things are hard if you want to, or if you already do, work in the forest industry. And so a scapegoat is tempting, right? There is real pain and hardship in logging communities, right? People can't make their mortgages. People are faced with the impossible choice to move so that their kids have more opportunities or can even attend school or stay in the place where they grow up and the only place that is home for them. That's real and that's hard. And it's a simpler narrative that it's just because there's too much conservation and too many parks. And that's why things are bad. That's why people can't log like their uncle used to, or like their grandmother used to, or whatever. The reality, which is a bit more complicated, is that the corporations have never done better. They've never posted higher quarterly profits than they have in the last 5 years. Things are incredible if you're one of the big 5 logging companies, and then even a lot of the smaller logging companies in BC, because they close mills and slash jobs for the same reason that they clear-cut endangered caribou habitat, because it's good for the bottom line, right? There is a sort of simmering awareness to that, but it's really hard to break through. The environmental movement needs to wear some of the blame for this, right? A lot of the poor class analysis and sort of the lazy, oh, these are heartless loggers that cut down trees because they don't care. That's the legacy of our movement, and we need to grapple with that, and we need to try to undo that. But there has been the concerted investment by government and industry, right, to the point where every time a politician speaks about it, they say, oh, we love old growth, but we have to think about rural jobs too. They make that connection almost unconsciously. And of course, the NDP, is more effective. They can do that with a greater level of authenticity. The Conservative Party in BC, up until recently called the BC Liberals, they can't make that argument, right? They can't say, oh, we can't forego old growth protection because, we care about rural jobs, because they clearly don't, right? It's everyone calls bullshit on that immediately, whereas the NDP can make that argument a bit more authentically, and they do again and again and again. So this is a tough piece.
That actually makes them more dangerous.
Absolutely.
In terms of the shifting that narrative, right? Like, people believe them. The people that shouldn't do. That's a real manufactured tension that you talk about, that exists. I'm glad you made the point that there is no longer that correlation between increased logging, increased jobs, and vice versa, because that exists with a lot of dirty industry, that they're awful job providers, that, building pipelines is like this burst of jobs and then a lot of layoffs. And continually we're watching advancements in terms of corporate advancements that are leading to allowing them to scale back on labor costs. And so it's actually ironic that they're billed as job creators when it's actually very precarious employment in the dirty fossil fuel industry.
In oil and gas or in timber and fiber from the forest, the companies, they always talk about efficiency, right? And in a jurisdiction like Canada, where there is stronger wages protected because of the blood, sweat, and tears of the labor movement, one of the most effective ways to increase efficiency is to slash jobs, right? To get those resources to market with fewer people's hands touching them here. And that's what the companies are always after. And then they turn around and call us the job killer. If I was up to kill jobs in the forest industry or in the oil and gas industry, I would just close up the Wilderness Committee and let the companies do it. Right? I'll never be as good at it as the big oil and gas companies or the big logging companies.
No. And I think like a lot of your efforts at the Wilderness Committee battle all sorts of different narratives, right? And disinformation, lies, right? We can call them lies. But obviously, we don't have time for you to debunk all of the myths. But, when I'm going through your Twitter feed, I see things like drawing attention to the blue hydrogen and all the other ways that big oil and gas and the logging industry sell, literally, this certain narrative. And then you folks have to do a lot of research to get the evidence behind it to publish something that counters this narrative. Then you need to get it amplified to the level that they do because they're assisted by the ministries associated with them, right, in doing this. So can you tell us what other big areas that you need to really be combating misinformation so that folks can be more effective, right? Like pointing out power structures is one of them. People misunderstand exactly who's calling the shots. We talked about this manufactured tension between workers and a just transition. What else is out there that we're not getting right?
Yeah, where to start? I think that I want to speak quickly about the power of these narratives and I spoke a little earlier about how a lot of greenwashing is so effective because it's stuff people want to hear. Right? People want to hear that there's a techno fix like blue carbon or like carbon capture and storage that will mean we can not pollute ourselves and sous vide the atmosphere without having to radically change the way our societies operate, because everyone knows how hard that will be. People want to believe that we have the most sustainable forest industry in the world because it plants trees and they grow back. People want to understand these things. It's hard because there is so much unknown, and the real solutions do require this departure from the status quo. And all big departures often always come at the expense of regular people, right? I'm thinking of like the shock doctrine as described by authors like Naomi Klein, and when there's these big moments of change within our current system, those in power game it to benefit themselves and benefit the wealthy, right? You can look at the rise of billionaires during the pandemic and as a very recent example. In terms of the sort of the misinformation, I mean, a classic one, there's misinformation, and then there's just sort of a societal missing of the point, to put it, for lack of a better phrase. The big one for me is around Indigenous rights and UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This was passed with the UN a number of years ago, signed on to by all but I think 4 countries, and it's like the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, right? Countries that have a clear vested interest in Indigenous rights not being too widely recognized. Since then, governments in Canada and subnational governments like BC's have made a lot more sympathetic statements towards it. And in 2019, BC became the first jurisdiction in North America to pass UNDRIP legislation that we call DRIPA, or the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And at the time, the whole deal was around like the whole conversation and all the, very smart pundits, I'm doing air quotes, their big thing was, oh, does this give consent to Indigenous people? So if a logging project or a pipeline or a mine is set to go ahead and the Indigenous nation says no, a mega dam, right, an offshore oil and gas projects, the list go on and on. If the Indigenous people say no, does it go ahead or does it not, right? It was, is it a veto, right? Is UNDRIP a veto? And to me, it was sad because it showed how far from getting it we are, right? If we think about, at its very core, we have this colonial, we have 2 or 3 colonial levels of colonial government, right? Federal, provincial, and municipal. At any given time, there's multiple jurisdictions that exist over Indigenous lands. How do we figure that out, right? It's not easy. It's really messy, but at the end of the day, it's a relationship. And when we think of any other relationship that's based on respect or consent, we would never use the term veto in it, right? If you're in a relationship with someone, if you have a partner, right, you have agreements and understandings. They can be financial, they can be social, intimate, and ideally those are consent. Those are based on consent. But I would never say like, oh yeah, my partner has like a veto on financial decisions, right? That would just be such a weird way to frame it, right? And even though I would never do anything without her, and she wouldn't do something without, like in effect that's what it is. But just the fact that we call it that's where our mind goes. Oh, if First Nations have consent, if Indigenous peoples have consent, that's a veto, right? To me, it underscores how far from really getting it we are, how far from getting it that we have to come together and form an actual meaningful relationship based on trust that features consent, but that isn't a veto, right? Just in terms of that framing, it's an interesting piece. And I don't know what you said that kind of sparked it for me, but you just sort of asked what else I kind of watch for. And to me, it's that whenever the topic of Indigenous rights come up, I'm always watching, and most of the time politicians of any stripe, NDP, conservative or liberal, bring up veto. And it's just, what are it doesn't bode well to me that's where our mind goes so quick.
How do you ensure that the work you do at the Wilderness Committee is decolonized and including Indigenous voices?
Yeah, this is the thing I think about the most. This is, when I'm awake at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling, it's mostly about this topic, and the answer is as best we can, right? Would be the one sentence answer, but it's hard, right? You have an environmental movement that in itself is formed on these problematic lines, right? Even and especially the history of Wilderness Committee and a lot of the language that we and other groups used in the 80s and early 90s, pristine, untouched, these words that invisibilize the existence of prior nations and of Indigenous peoples. Even the term wilderness, right? When you look up the dictionary definition of that term, it's extremely cringeworthy. That wasn't sort of the founding ethos of the organization, and it's not sort of the value. That's not how we define wilderness. We talk from time to time about changing our name. We probably will one day. It's not at the top of the priority list right now because odds are when we hear from people in communities, they're concerned about how we work and what we do, not what we're called. And that's what our focus is on. So it's a learning process. Like everything we do, it's tempting to rush, right? This is an urgent question. How does environmental organization exist and advocate for lands and waters that aren't ours as white settlers, as settler people in BC and Canada? Is that possible at all, right? That's a really tough question, and we're doing our best to learn and unlearn, to show up in spaces where we're asked to, and to pipe down when we're asked to as well, by folks in communities. it's hard, right? That we get conflicting advice. People from an Indigenous nation. There's 204 in BC alone, right? And we'll hear, the Wilderness Committee or your movement should do this, this, and this, from one person, and then something entirely the opposite, sometimes from someone else in the same community, right? And so navigating that is extremely difficult. Again, I talked about the relationship sort of between Canada, for lack of, as a structure, and and all the hundreds of Indigenous nations, and I guess that can be distilled down to the personal, or I guess the organizational level too, right? We do lean into our relationships and we try to honor and show up for those, right? We built connections and partnerships and authentic friendships with people from First Nations in BC from day one when we were founded in 1980. A lot of those are still ongoing and live and things that we cherish and try to honor. So that's what we look to in that regard. But it's always second guessing, always uneasy, and we do our best and try to really recognize how far we have to go on that front.
The first thing I thought of when you mentioned the BC NDP needed to, take better stock of where the old growth, and then you tell me, 214 Indigenous nations within the province. One would only imagine that's a complete breakdown of a communication if one is not tapping into that immense resource of knowledge that exists with Indigenous folks who have been caretakers of the land for time immemorial. And yet we sit there as settlers saying, well, we just don't know enough about the forest yet to protect it. And that is just such a huge issue for me, because especially from a government that enacted or was the first to kind of put UNDRIP on the books. But there's endless examples of Horgan's government just having policies and working with the RCMP in complete contradiction of that document. That would be an entire episode in itself. I feel like greenwashing. I'm looking through my notes and just like the length of our conversation so far, and there's so much to talk about around greenwashing and perhaps COP27 and just, I just feel like another episode brewing on top of this. This is our first episode really that dove into climate. We're a pretty new podcast. So I feel like this has opened the door for a lot of other conversations that need to be had, especially amongst progressives who put a lot of efforts into climate action, maybe within the party or whatnot, that will be better served now, have a better understanding of the barriers that are in place. And they're not just kind of your typical barriers that we would have assumed, in terms of capital and whatnot. But the alliance, there is a natural alliance, and this has been talked about around the world, but it comes up in conversations around concepts like the Green New Deal. But there's a natural alliance. The general income inequality and all the problems that stem from that and the climate crisis stem from the same cause, and so there is all kinds of paths that put us on a better trajectory and start us building towards a future that is actually survivable in terms of climate change, that are better than things are now for average working people. It's just been so poorly articulated, and again, the tropes of people who want climate action being idealists or totally out of touch with people who have to make rent or put food on the table, and then a lot of middle class white, predominantly environmentalists being sold on this myth that people who work in the oil and gas industry are heartless brutes who do
drive their huge trucks through a swamp on the way to work every day just to do a bit of extra damage, right? Neither of those things are true, right? A lot of environmental activists come from working class backgrounds, understand these struggles and are part of them. And a lot of resource industry workers are extremely concerned about changes to the climate and the impacts of that on their futures. And so there is that natural alliance there. And, you know, in the political space, you know, the parties on the center and the right really lean into that division, right? And really appeal to the second group and say that, oh, environmentalism is about putting people out of work. And then, you know, the center, right, the liberal side of the spectrum, you know, the Liberal Party federally, or parties like the BC NDP here, they're not that belligerent about it, but they use that. They don't challenge that myth, that false dichotomy. They say, you know, it's a challenge. We have to balance the environment and jobs. You know, we can't go too far on one because it'll come at the expense of the other. And so I think, you know, a powerful way to sort of transcend that political calcification is for alliances to be formed amongst the environment, between the environmental movement and labor and other working class movements to kind of take back the narrative and say, no, we need these solutions that will make things better for average working people, that will make things more affordable, that will create the security and the, you know, the solid job that people can depend on, and it will be there with a robust social safety net while we set the rarest ecosystems off limits to extraction and while we dramatically reduce our emissions. These things are possible, and if both sides kind of call for that, then the charade will fall apart, and both the right and the center won't be able to spin the narrative anymore.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of work to be done in terms of the just transition, coming to a consensus on what that looks like and communicating it so that there isn't that tension that we talked about before and that you brought up again. That and you can't really blame people, and I know you're not, but for buying that messaging. When we've seen the government act on industries swiftly, quite often that has laid off a lot of people with very little support. Ask the East Coast, right? They know all about that. So the mistrust that exists and the diminishing social safety net, that's scary. We totally get it. And it'll be interesting to see how those relationships go forward. Because, it's all part of first recognizing the need but that cooperation with labor and again, I know there's some folks that are trying to work within these progressive parties to bring them around to, better policies and holding to their promises. But I guess that's always a kind of exhaustive endeavor within politics, making folks, making them hold their promises.
Yeah, it's absolutely understandable. A lot of the policies and the changes in cases of extraction, the limits that the Wilderness Committee and others are calling for, if they were just to be implemented within the status quo, they would result in hardship, right? It can't be siloed, or these changes can't occur in a vacuum. They need to come with that holistic change. And, the environmental movement and my organization, for its part in over our history has shied away from that a little bit, right? Partly because of, the insistence to stay in your lane, or things like that, and partly because it was seen as strategic. But we need to be advocating for this system level change, and again, no environmental organization that's as old as ours has done a great job of that. We're working to improve. There are some bright spots, some places where we've done this well. But that message needs to be clearly articulated and without blame in the meantime. again, it is tough when a lot of the folks that I would like to ally with in that effort, in parties, political parties like the NDP, and in labor organizations like the United Steelworkers, when rather than being willing partners in building that narrative, they're often the most hostile opposition. A few years ago, just before the pandemic started, there was a huge strike by the United Steelworkers against the biggest logging company on the West Coast. They're called Western Forest Products. And it was bitter, right? And the company was trying to claw back pensions and create more allowances for contractors and non-union workers and all this horrible corporate stuff. And the steelworkers were fighting them bitterly. And I was like, this is like, they should be. These workers deserve these rights. Western Forest Products is terrible. And just because I oppose their logging practices doesn't mean that I think that the workers should have their benefits clawed away or anything like that. And so, we organized people to go out and stand in support of them. Of the steelworkers at these rallies, right? And I talked to rank and file members, and those conversations would go pretty well. And at the end of them, I'd go up and approach the leaders that were there, like speaking at the rally. And it was often, like I'd say the term "just transition," and it was like I cursed their grandmother's name or something like that. It was like a dirty word, right? There was this level of gaslighting, right? Where, the older union leadership would say, oh man, like, if environmentalism, like you guys won in the 90s, right? Like when I got into logging in the late 1970s, we used to cut down trees with eagle's nests still in them. And you should have seen how bad the logging was. It's way better
Progress.
now. All true, right? It is better now, but that's nothing to be proud of. And they, the leader of a local during that strike said, if I was an environmental activist, I would be sitting in my backyard sipping daiquiris because my job. And I was like, daiquiris, really?
Aren't we glad they aren't environmentalists?
It's this certain,
and it's avocado toast, by the way.
Yeah, it's this certain. I'm a millennial. It's this certain mindset, right? And again, that power is really entrenched, right? It's often referred to in the BC NDP as the old boys club, for lack of a better word, and also that's a perfect word, right? and how do we overcome that? And we do see some positive ways to do it, but it requires it ironically requires that the very thing that's been made harder during the pandemic, and that's face-to-face connection. In 2017, up until the end of 2019, when we were planning to start again in 2020, and then COVID started, we would host like town hall meetings, public conversations in logging towns, right? If we want to do a public meeting about old growth, in downtown Vancouver, we can get a couple hundred people there, no problem. But they're all
preaching to the choir a little bit.
Totally. So we would hold these meetings in small towns, on northern Vancouver, and we do events with and we're like counting the people in there, and we're like, this is like 1/5 of the whole town is here at this meeting, right? Like a big chunk, or 10% of the whole town is at this thing. And, people would come, out of the woods. They'd have like Carhartts and high-vis vests and chainsaw oil and sawdust.
So literally out of the woods, not just out of the blue.
Day. Yeah. And it was intense, right? I don't thrive in that face-to-face context. And like, I would be nervous to the point of throwing up before we'd start the meeting. And we'd have these conversations that were fascinating and mind-blowing. And the one that sticks with me, I think this was in 2018, we had this guy show up, and he was adamant that we were wrong, that we were saying the wrong thing. I think he interrupted us like 10 times, kind of like in our introduction, right? Like he was fired up, and, every second question he would put up his hand and say, no, that's wrong. And he really, really pushed us. He worked in the logging industry. And we finished up that meeting. I think he stayed late and talked to us. And then a couple nights later, we were like 2 hours down the highway in the next town doing the same meeting, right? We do like these series of meetings. And maybe 5 minutes into the meeting, I was up on the stage and I noticed this movement in the back and this bright yellow flash. And it's this same guy. It was this high-vis vest from the town before a couple of days earlier. And he came back in for round 2. And we were like, oh, man. And same deal, he was jumping in the conversation all the time, really combative, really challenging. We wrapped up the meeting. He stayed after and talked to us as we were packing up our projector and packing up our tables and stuff. He helped us carry it out to the car, and then he gave it to us in the parking lot for another 20 minutes. And he operated a small forest license on the west side of the island. And he said, look, the way the industry's structured, I have to sell some of my cut as raw logs and I have to log old growth and a lot of the changes. And I said, right, how many hectares do you manage? And he told me, and it was a small amount. And I said, look, a lot of the big system level problems are the big players, the huge corporate licensees. And a lot of these changes need to be targeted at the biggest players with space and funding to help smaller operators like you make that transition. And he said, yeah, but you're never going to sell that to the fuckers in Victoria, right? Referencing the provincial government. And I was like, I think those guys are fuckers too.
You bonded over your hatred for politicians.
Yeah, but it took 4 hours of yelling at each other back and forth, right? And after decades of this tree huggers versus loggers trope, or now it's climate activists versus oil and gas workers, there's that animosity and there's that pain, and that has to be worked through. And how you do that at scale, right, with thousands and thousands of climate and environmental activists and thousands of resource industry workers. I wish I had that formula, but that's
I feel like that if that was a TikTok series and you had recorded the whole back and forth, you won't have to replicate those hard conversations a million times over. Like we can't have Torrance, Coste everywhere, but because that's such a good analogy.
That's funny. That instance predated TikTok by 3 or 4 years, but it's you're right. That would have been a way. But yeah, that and then also how we don't be naive, on that front, and how we reckon with the fact that a lot of working class folks in resource industries have been targeted and recruited by far right movements, right? This is, the I love oil and gas kind of astroturf campaigns on the prairies, and everything from the crossovers between sort of pro pipeline activism and the truckers convoy, for example. We need to be cognizant of that, and in terms of other alliances that we're building, right? As we try to move to decolonize our work and to do this advocacy in a bit better way, a lot of folks that we work with out on the land from Indigenous communities aren't super keen to work with, the local logging contingent in that town, right? That the strike was welcomed by a lot of land-based activists from Indigenous nations on the coast because they could go out on their territory without, F-350s filled with big loggers out on the land, right? That's a piece that we need to learn and grapple with, and again, that concerted effort of the rising far right to tap into that angst and pain in resource communities and amongst working class people. That is a huge thing that we need to be wary of and cognizant of. There's there's several grassroots groups to advocate for the forest industry, and their sources of funding are really shadowy. There's a huge need to be cognizant there and to think about that sort of dynamic when we're trying to build those alliances.
I appreciate you explaining all of the ins and outs of the political relationships over in BC. I think a lot of it is replicated in varying circumstances throughout the country. So there's a lot of value to folks starting to understand how this works and how the approach needs to shift away from awareness raising to really kind of challenging those power structures. But I love where the conversation went there in terms of communication. That's just the word that keeps coming to my head, like in terms of building trust with the various communities and that you talked about and challenging that narrative. So I appreciate that folks like the I appreciate that folks like the Wilderness Committee are out there, amongst many, many other people doing that kind of work. And I want to thank you. I feel like we could talk about this for a really long time. My producer's going to be very jealous. He missed this conversation, Santiago. And, but yeah, I think it's going to lead to a whole lot of other key conversations that will probably play out here on this show. So I might have to bug you to come back, Torrance.
Yeah,
but
any time. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, and it's interesting that you mentioned communications and in trying to talk about this and working with media. I struggle a lot because I feel like it's been an hour or more here and we've barely scratched the surface, and most of the inquiries I get on these issues are from CBC News, where they play 2 10-second clips, or the Globe and Mail, where they run one quote, right? And so,
it's like your least favorite quote, right? Your least.
Oh yeah, they always pick the worst
watered down version.
Interview, but at the end of the day, it still only is a 5-minute interview, right? And so long form podcasts is my favorite means of media to go on and speak of, because it's the only one that you could even come close to doing justice, right? I feel like this was a good introduction to a lot of this, right? And it's as long as every other media interview that I've done this year, probably all put together. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'd be happy to come back on.
Great. Like maybe it'll be part of a series. Like we tend to branch off like that. So like I said, it's the first time we've really gotten our feet wet in terms of the environmentalist movement and climate justice here in Canada. So definitely something we need to build on. And I do appreciate it. I was very much educated, not just through our conversation, but by doing research about your organization and the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we'll chat again.
Yeah, I hope so. Thanks again so much for having me on. And I'd love to hear from listeners. I'm on Twitter. You mentioned a couple times at Torrance Coste. And I'd love to build some connections from this and keep the conversation going.
Amazing. We'll be sure to include a bunch of links to Torrance Coste himself and Wilderness Committee so that people can keep up to date on the good work that you're doing. Thank you so much, Torrance. That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.